The loud crash of shattered glass jolted John awake. His loyal Rottweiler growled menacingly, already positioned at the front door. John's hands trembled as he held Claire's phone, the text message glowing like a cruel beacon of truth. "Can't wait to see you again. Same time tomorrow?" "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Thomas sneered, his voice cold and calculated. "My father is Moretti. If you think this ends with Claire, you're wrong." The gunfire echoed through the darkened woods as Moretti's men closed in. Max, the Rottweiler, lunged at the nearest intruder. John stood over Claire and Thomas, their terrified eyes pleading for mercy. "All I ever wanted was the truth." Welcome to the Alibis Exposed, where trust meets betrayal in the dark. John had spent years running from his past, working endless hours in a city that never stopped. His life was predictable, and his marriage to Claire had become another routine. She was beautiful, but distant, no longer the woman he had married. Their connection had faded over the years, swallowed by work, by distance, by things left unsaid. When he suggested moving to the countryside, it felt like the right decision. The city had grown stale, and the thought of starting over somewhere quiet appealed to Claire. They were both ready for a change. John, with his quiet resolve, saw the move as an opportunity to reset, to rebuild their lives, to reconnect with each other. And maybe, just maybe, the peace would calm their troubled marriage. But Claire wasn't so sure. She agreed, but a part of her was still restless. The countryside was tranquil, but it also had a weight to it, a quiet that allowed her thoughts to drift back to places she wasn't ready to revisit. It wasn't long after they settled in that John began to notice changes in her. She wasn't as present as she had been before. She spent more time away from the house, sometimes walking the dog, Rex, through the woods, sometimes just sitting by the lake. At first, John brushed it off, telling himself that she just needed space, that they both needed to adjust. But as the days turned to weeks, John began to sense something was wrong. Claire's absences became longer. She started looking at him with a coldness he didn't understand. When she was home, the distance between them was palpable, like an invisible wall he couldn't tear down. It was late one night, after Rex had scratched at the door, wanting to be let out, that John decided to follow her. She was sitting on the porch, her back to him, staring out at the trees. He watched her, wondering what had happened to the woman he once knew, the woman who had laughed with him in the kitchen, who had loved him without question. She hadn't spoken to him much in days, and he felt as if he were losing her. Claire's voice broke the silence. "I'm not sure I belong here," she said quietly. John stepped forward. "What do you mean? We agreed on this. This is supposed to be our fresh start." "I don't know anymore. It feels like running away," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's just the silence, or maybe... I don't know." John didn't respond. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her. There was a sadness in her eyes, something deep that he didn't understand. It scared him. The next morning, Claire left early, as she often did now. John watched her go, and for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to follow. Instead, he turned his attention to Rex, who was sitting by the door, looking up at him with loyal eyes. As the day wore on, John went about his tasks, but Claire's absence was heavy on his mind. He was trying to fix things, he was, but somehow it always felt like he was missing something, something important. That afternoon, as he worked on the property, he felt a strange pull to check on her. Maybe she was just going for a walk, or maybe she needed some space to think. He didn't expect what he found when he followed the same trail Claire had walked the previous evening. The path she had taken led deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thick and the shadows stretched long. And then he saw it. There, standing by a clearing, was Claire. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man. John's heart skipped. He knew him. It was Thomas, Claire's ex-boyfriend. Thomas was a figure from Claire's past, someone John had never fully understood. The way Claire spoke of him was always with a strange mixture of fondness and regret, as if there was something unresolved between them. John watched from the shadows as they spoke. Their conversation was too far away to hear, but the body language was clear. Claire was leaning in too close to Thomas. John could see the way they looked at each other. It wasn't just friendly, it wasn't just a catch-up. There was something more, something that cut straight to the core of everything John feared. His hands clenched into fists as he watched them. The man she had once loved, the man she had let go of years ago, was standing there in the woods with her. John's stomach churned, his mind raced. He wanted to confront them, but he knew that doing so would only escalate things. Instead, he turned and left quietly, making his way back to the house. The betrayal hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating him with its weight. That night, John couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire and Thomas together. He knew something was happening between them, but he couldn't bring himself to face it. What if Claire was going to leave him? What if she had already left him in her heart? The next morning, when Claire returned, she acted as if nothing had changed. But John saw the shift in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at him, the way she seemed lost in thought. That night, as he lay in bed, John made a decision. He was going to get to the bottom of this. No more pretending, no more lies. If Claire was going to betray him, he was going to find out. And when he did, there would be consequences. John couldn't escape the nagging feeling in his gut. Every time Claire smiled, every time she touched him, there was something different in it. It wasn't the warmth he used to feel when she looked at him. It was colder, more distant. And every time Thomas's name came up, he saw her face flicker. With a brief sadness, something she couldn't hide, something she refused to acknowledge. He tried to talk to her about it, to bring up her ex, but Claire would brush him off, pretending like nothing was wrong. She would say things like, "He's just an old friend," or "We were young, it's nothing now." But John knew better. He wasn't a fool. He could see the way Thomas looked at her, the way Claire's posture softened when he was near. It wasn't long before John realized that whatever had once been between them had never truly gone away. It had been buried, hidden, but it was still there, waiting to surface, ready to disrupt their lives. And as much as John tried to deny it, a part of him knew that their marriage was on the line. He watched Claire more closely now, studying her every move. He noticed the long hours she spent on the phone, speaking in whispers when she thought he wasn't listening. He saw the way she seemed distracted, her thoughts elsewhere, even when they were in the same room. One evening, when Claire had gone out to meet a friend, John decided to check her phone. It was something he'd never done before. He trusted her, or at least he had. He hadn't expected things to turn out like this. But now the trust was slipping through his fingers like sand. His fingers trembled as he unlocked her phone. He scanned through her messages, nothing that seemed too out of the ordinary at first. Then he saw it. A message from Thomas. "I miss you, Claire. I wish we could go back to how it was before. I never stopped loving you." John felt the words cut deep, slicing through his chest. It was as if the breath had been knocked out of him. He'd seen the affection between them, but reading it in black and white, seeing the words that had been exchanged in secret, felt like a punch to the gut. There were more messages, long ones, filled with longing, and promises of things that had never been said aloud. John's anger flared, but there was also a deep, sinking feeling of betrayal. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the screen, but it felt like hours. He could hear Rex growling softly in the other room, as if sensing the tension in the house. When Claire came home, John didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Claire, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. "Hey, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice sweet but guarded. "You look like you've seen a ghost." John said nothing, his eyes cold and steady. He didn't need to ask her about the message. He already knew the truth. The question now was what to do with it. Claire seemed to hesitate, her face flickering, with something between guilt and fear. But she quickly masked it, forcing a smile. "John, I told you before, it's nothing." John's voice was low but firm. "Nothing? You call that nothing?" Claire stiffened, her eyes darting to the door as though she might escape. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The truth was out, and it had caught them both in its grip. "I told you, John," Claire began, her words faltering. "It was a mistake. I don't know why I even agreed to meet him. But it's over, I swear." John's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout at her, to make her feel the same pain that was gnawing at him. But instead, he stood there, paralyzed by the betrayal, unable to find the words. Rex, sensing the tension, stood at John's side, his ears perked, his body stiff. The dog, loyal and steadfast, seemed to understand that something was changing. Claire, on the other hand, was oblivious to the shift in the air. She took a step forward, reaching for him, but John took a step back. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Claire," John said, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't make a move to comfort him. Instead, she stood there, waiting for him to react, to say something that would make it all go away. But John wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. Days passed, and John found himself sinking deeper into a pit of doubt and anger. The messages from Thomas kept haunting him, replaying over and over in his mind. He tried to talk to Claire again, but the conversations were always the same. She was sorry, it was a mistake. Nothing had happened between them, but John knew better. Something had happened. He could see it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the way she spoke about Thomas, as though he was someone she couldn't let go of. The trust between them had been shattered, and now it was just a matter of what came next. Would Claire continue to lie to him? Would she keep running back to Thomas, to the man who had once broken her heart? Or would John finally make a choice, whether to stay and fight for their marriage, or to let go and walk away? One thing was certain. Things would never be the same. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. John tried to continue with his life, but nothing felt the same. Every moment with Claire was filled with a quiet tension, the unspoken truth hanging between them like an invisible barrier. She continued with her daily routines, but John saw the way she flinched. Whenever he looked at her too long, the way she avoided his questions, the way she seemed to pull away every time he tried to reach out. It wasn't just the secrecy surrounding Thomas that ate away at him. It was the look in Claire's eyes when she spoke of him. It wasn't guilt, as if she had made a mistake. It was something deeper, something more complicated, a regret that she couldn't let go of. John had tried to confront her again, but each time she'd shut down, deflecting, convincing him that everything was fine. But nothing was fine. The worst part was that John didn't know how to fix it. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to anymore. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted, was no longer the same. He didn't recognize the person in front of him, and that terrified him. The idea of losing her had always been a distant fear, something he never truly believed could happen. Now it was his reality. One night, unable to sleep, John wandered through the house, trying to clear his head. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the sound of crickets filling the silence. Rex was by his side, his ever-present companion, as they walked around the perimeter of the house. The world around them was still, but inside John, everything felt chaotic, out of control. His thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas. He couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't just a shadow for Claire, it was something she was still living in. He had been a part of her life before him, and somehow he had never truly disappeared. The next morning, John decided to take matters into his own hands. He was done with the uncertainty, done with letting Claire control the narrative. If she wouldn't tell him the truth, he would force her to. He tracked down the address for Thomas, a quiet, unassuming house on the outskirts of town. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do once he got there, but he was done being in the dark. Claire had been lying to him, and he wasn't going to let her continue. John drove through the empty roads, his grip tight on the wheel. Rex, sitting in the passenger seat, seemed to sense his unease. His ears perked up as they approached their destination. The house came into view, a modest place with overgrown bushes and a worn-out mailbox. It looked nothing like the mansion John had imagined. When he pulled into the driveway, John sat there for a moment, staring at the house. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find. Anger, betrayal, fear. Or maybe just the truth, something to finally piece together the fractured puzzle of his life. He stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. The door to the house opened before he had a chance to knock. Thomas stood there, tall and imposing, with a look of surprise in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of curiosity. "I need to talk to you," John said, his voice low. "About Claire." Thomas raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is between you and her, not me." But John wasn't backing down. He had come this far, and he wasn't leaving without answers. "It's not just between us anymore," John said. "You've been messaging her. I know what you're up to." A flash of something guilt crossed Thomas's face, but he quickly masked it. "What are you accusing me of?" he asked, his tone darkening. John's anger flared. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm trying to understand what the hell is going on. Why can't she let you go? What do you still have over her?" Thomas stepped forward, his face hardening. "You don't know anything about me, John. You don't know anything about what Claire and I had. It wasn't just some fling, it was real. And it's not something you can just erase." John felt a surge of rage. "She's my wife now, not yours. And if you think I'm just going to stand by and let you pull her away from me again, you're wrong." For a moment, there was silence between them, thick and heavy. Then, with a small, almost amused smile, Thomas spoke again. "You think you know everything, don't you? You think you understand her, but you don't. You never will." John clenched his fists, holding back the urge to strike out. But he kept his composure, refusing to let Thomas see how deeply his words cut. "I know enough. I know she's been lying to me. I know she's still hung up on you. And I know it's only a matter of time before she chooses you again." Thomas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You really think it's that simple? You think Claire is just going to leave you for me? You don't understand. She's not some prize to be won. You're in way over your head, John." Before John could respond, Thomas turned and walked back into the house. "If you want answers, you'll have to ask her yourself. But be careful, John. The truth isn't always what you think it is." With that, the door slammed shut. John stood there for a long moment, trying to process everything he had just heard. Thomas's words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. What did he mean? What did he know that John didn't? As John got back into the car and drove back home, a sense of dread settled in his chest. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous this game became. John barely slept that night. His mind was too full of Thomas's words, too heavy with the weight of everything he had just discovered. The quiet house felt suffocating, the silence between him and Claire unbearable. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Was Claire still in love with Thomas? Or was she simply trapped by the past, unable to fully break free? And why was Thomas so insistent on keeping her close, even after all these years? But one thing had become clear. John couldn't stay in the dark any longer. He needed to confront Claire to make her face the truth. If she was still hung up on her ex, there was no way they could move forward. But if she was lying to him, hiding something darker, he couldn't live with that either. The following morning, John woke up early, his stomach twisted in knots. Rex was already up, pacing around the house, clearly agitated. The dog had always been protective of John, but today there was a different energy about him. Rex's usual calm demeanor had shifted to something more intense, more alert. John noticed the dog's heightened senses. Rex had always been a barometer for trouble, his instincts sharp, his loyalty unwavering. When Rex sensed danger, he didn't hesitate. And now the dog seemed to know something was off, just as John did. As John got dressed, he noticed Rex, staring intently out the window, his gaze fixed on the driveway. John stepped closer, trying to see what had caught the dog's attention, but he didn't see anything at first. But Rex wasn't looking at nothing. He was looking at Claire's car, parked at the edge of the property. It was early, too early for her to be out. John's suspicion grew, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew she was hiding something. He had to find out what. When Claire came back inside, her face was flushed, as though she'd been caught off guard. She avoided John's eyes and immediately went to the kitchen, acting like everything was normal. But John wasn't fooled. He could see the guilt in the way she moved, in the way her eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting his. "Where were you this morning?" John asked, his voice flat, unyielding. Claire froze, her hand still on the kitchen counter. For a moment, she didn't answer. John took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. He was done with the games. "I know something's going on, Claire. Where were you?" Rex growled low in his throat, standing beside John. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down Claire's spine. The dog's protective stance was unmistakable. I was just out for a walk," Claire replied, her voice shaky. "I needed some fresh air. You know how it is." But John wasn't buying it. The way she was acting now, it was too rehearsed. "A walk? At this hour?" Before Claire could respond, John's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, his heart skipping when he saw the name on the screen. Thomas. He hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. He stared at the phone for a long moment, considering whether to answer. But before he could decide, Rex lunged forward, growling furiously. The phone clattered to the ground as Rex barked loudly, his eyes locked on the door, his body tense. Claire jumped back, startled by the dog's sudden aggression. John barely had time to react before the doorbell rang. Rex's barking escalated, his growls growing louder and more threatening. John rushed to the door, knowing exactly who it was before he even saw him. Thomas. The man who had caused all of this was standing on their doorstep, his eyes cold, calculating. Rex was beside John, his body a solid mass of fury, standing guard, as if he were a shield protecting his owner. Thomas didn't seem intimidated by the dog, but John could see the unease in his eyes. Rex wasn't just a pet, he was a guardian, a force to be reckoned with. Thomas had always known that. He wasn't afraid of John, but he understood that Rex was a different kind of threat. "What do you want?" John demanded, his voice rough with barely contained anger. Thomas glanced at Rex, then back at John. "I think it's time we had a real conversation. You don't know what you're dealing with, John, but I'm about to make sure you do." John stepped forward, blocking the door. "I'm done with your games, Thomas. I know about the messages. I know about you and Claire. If you think for 1 second I'm going to let you walk in here like nothing's wrong, you're mistaken." Thomas smirked. "You have no idea what you're up against, John. Claire is just a pawn in all of this. You're not the one she's really tied to." Rex's low growl was the only sound between them now. The dog was practically vibrating with tension, his eyes locked on Thomas, his teeth bared in a silent warning. John's mind raced. He didn't know what Thomas meant, but the way he said it, like there was something darker lurking beneath the surface, only made him more determined to get answers. He wasn't going to let this man waltz in and out of his life and his wife's like it was nothing. "You'd better start explaining yourself," John said, his voice cold. Thomas took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You really think Claire's the one who's been lying to you? You don't even know the half of it. She's not the problem, John. You've never been the problem. But there's something much bigger than either of you." Rex's growl intensified, and John knew it was more than just the usual protectiveness. The dog was picking up on something that John wasn't seeing yet. Thomas knew too much, and it was clear that this wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. "Come back when you've figured out who your real enemies are," Thomas said, his voice low and almost mocking. "And trust me, John, you're not going to like what you find." With that, Thomas turned and walked away, leaving John standing there, his mind racing. Rex remained at John's side, his eyes still locked on the direction Thomas had gone. The dog wasn't going to let him out of sight, and neither was John. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. John didn't have time for sleep, not anymore. The tension in the house had escalated to a point where every moment felt like a ticking time bomb. Thomas's warning gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. It was clear that something bigger was at play, and John had no intention of waiting around to figure it out. As the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something dangerous, something inevitable. Rex had barely moved from the front door all morning, his watchful eyes scanning the property with a level of intensity John hadn't seen before. The dog wasn't just guarding the house, he was sensing something, or someone. Claire acted like nothing had changed. She went about her day, keeping herself busy with meaningless tasks, her voice polite but distant when she spoke to John. But he wasn't fooled. The silence between them was louder than any argument they could have. She was hiding something, and John wasn't about to let her get away with it. Around midday, John decided it was time. He couldn't keep walking around in circles, waiting for Claire to confess, or for Thomas to come knocking again. He needed answers now. He grabbed his keys and looked down at Rex, who was still pacing at the door, his eyes trained on the driveway. "Let's go, boy," John muttered. Rex immediately perked up, his tail giving a quick thump against the floor before he trotted to the door with an almost knowing urgency. John and Rex climbed into the truck. The dog was more alert than usual, his eyes scanning every corner of the property as they pulled away. John's thoughts were a whirlwind. He didn't know what he was hoping to find at Thomas's house, but he couldn't keep pretending that things were normal. The lie was too thick now, and it needed to be torn down. When they arrived at Thomas's house, John didn't hesitate. He stormed up to the door, his fists clenched and his heart racing. Rex was right behind him, growling under his breath. The door swung open almost instantly, as if Thomas had been waiting for him. "You really can't stay away, can you?" Thomas said, his tone almost amused, but there was a flicker of concern behind his eyes when he saw Rex standing next to John, his teeth bared.
"I'm done with your games," John snapped. "I need the truth, right now." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He looked at the dog, then back at John, weighing his options. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning for John to come in. "Fine. You
"Want the truth? I'll give it to you." Inside, the house was quiet. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. John's eyes scanned the room, but it was clear that Thomas wasn't hiding anything. The secrets weren't in the house. They were in the past. "You're going to have to understand something, John," Thomas began, his voice low, but the edge of danger clear in his words. "What you're up against is bigger than you think. It's not just me. It's not just Claire. There's someone else pulling the strings here." John's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he demanded. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes locking onto John's. "You've heard of my father, haven't you? The man who runs things in this town?" John's mind raced. Of course, he had heard of Antonio Moretti. The name was whispered in certain circles, the kind of circles that John had always avoided. The Italian mob boss who had made a name for himself in the United States in the 1980s, now firmly entrenched in the shadows of the city. No one dared to cross him, and anyone who did found themselves in a world of trouble. But why is Claire
involved in all this? John asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because your wife," Thomas said, his gaze hardening, "is more connected to my father than you could ever imagine. She's been a part of this world for longer than you've known her, and she doesn't even know how deep it goes."
John's mind was spinning. This was far worse than he had imagined. But Thomas wasn't finished. "My father never forgets. He doesn't let go of things easily. If Claire thinks she can walk away from him, if she thinks she can hide in your little country house, she's wrong. My father doesn't lose, and neither does anyone who's crossed him." John's breath caught in his chest. Claire had been running from something, but he had no idea it was this dangerous. It was clear now that whatever she had done in the past, it wasn't just about her. It was about something far bigger, far more dangerous, and he was in the middle
of it. As if on cue, Rex growled loudly, his eyes fixed on the window. John spun around, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right.
The dog's hackles were raised, and his gaze was locked on the driveway. John's hand went to his waist, where his gun was holstered, but before he could move, the door swung open again. It wasn't Thomas this time. It was a group of men who looked like they'd stepped out of a nightmare. They were dressed in suits, their expressions cold and unfeeling. The air around them crackled with danger. John didn't need to ask who they were. They were Moretti's men, and they had come for something. Rex let out a savage bark and lunged toward the door, but John grabbed him, pulling the dog back. "Stay," he whispered urgently, but the dog wasn't listening. His loyalty to John was stronger than his training. "Get back, John," Thomas said, his voice tinged with a strange urgency. "This isn't your fight. You don't know what you're dealing with." But John was done listening. This wasn't just Claire's past, it was his now, too. If these men were connected to Moretti, then they were coming for him, coming for Claire. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. "Who are you?" John asked, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. One of the men smirked, his voice low and mocking. "We don't answer to you, Mr. Davis. You've got something we want, and we're not leaving without it." John felt his pulse race. He wasn't sure what they wanted, but he had a sinking feeling that it was something far worse than his wife's past. Before he could react, the man raised his hand, signaling the others to move in. John reached for his gun, but Rex was already ahead of him. With a deafening bark, the Rottweiler lunged at the nearest man, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The chaos erupted in an instant, but John wasn't focused on the fight. He was focused on Claire, on the truth that had been hidden from him for too long. There was no going back now. The moment had come. The truth was here, and it was more dangerous than John could have ever imagined. The scene was chaos. Rex's snarls echoed through the room as he fought off Moretti's men with relentless fury. His teeth sank into one man's leg, while his growls drowned out the voices of everyone else in the room. John's heart pounded in his chest, but his eyes were locked on Claire, who was standing frozen by the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides. She had seen it all. The dog's wild defense of John, the men who had barged in with menacing intent. She wasn't a stranger to violence, but this was different. "Claire!" John shouted, his voice hoarse as he shoved past the men. He reached her in a few long strides, his hand gripping her wrist. "What the hell is going on? Why is Moretti's crew here? Why did you—" Claire pulled back, shaking her head as though she couldn't process the reality unfolding in front of her. Her lips parted as if she wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She glanced at the fight, at Rex still clamped on one of the men's arm, the other men struggling to get free.
"John, you don't understand," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. John's grip tightened. "I don't understand. You've been lying to me this whole time, Claire. What the hell are you mixed up in? This is not just some ex-boyfriend drama. Moretti's men don't show up to someone's door for no reason." She looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. And for the first time, John saw fear in them, a fear of him, a fear of the truth. "Thomas," Claire's
voice cracked. "Thomas is my half-brother. Antonio Moretti is my father." The revelation hit John like a physical blow. His legs wavered beneath him and he nearly staggered back. He felt like he was suffocating, his mind scrambling to process what Claire had just said. Thomas wasn't just some ex-boyfriend. He was her brother. And Antonio Moretti wasn't a distant figure in her past. He was her father. "Your father?" John's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the chaos in the room. "Yes, John," she whispered, her hand clutching her chest.
as if holding in the pain of the truth. I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you, protect us. But it's too late now. I can't run anymore. John stared at her, his anger boiling over. All this time, you lied. You used me. We were nothing more than a cover for your family's mess. Claire's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't speak. What was there to say?
John could see the pain in her expression, the torment of years of hiding from a past she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Rex had bitten down harder, pulling one of the men off the others and knocking him to the floor. The mobsters were getting desperate now, trying to wrestle the dog off with every tool they had, but Rex was too fierce, too determined to protect John. Then it happened. One of the men pulled out a knife, and before John could react, it was plunged into Rex's side. The dog yelped in agony, but he kept fighting, his blood staining the floor. "No!" John screamed as Rex's body crumpled to the ground, his loyal eyes still fixed on his owner. The sight of Rex's struggle, the unwavering loyalty of the dog, struck John harder than anything had before. The realization that Rex, the one creature who had never wavered, was gone, twisted John's stomach. His heart pounded as he rushed to his dog's side, but it was too late. Rex's body was still, his breathing shallow. For a moment, everything stopped. The chaos, the fighting, the fear, it all faded into a blur. Rex was gone. His protector, his loyal companion, was dead. John. Claire's voice trembled as she stepped closer, her eyes on Rex's lifeless form. She reached out, but John jerked away, his face contorted in grief and rage. "Don't!" he hissed, his voice harsh, raw. "Don't come near me! Not after—"
All of this? Claire recoiled, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't back away. She was as much a victim of this situation as anyone, but John couldn't see it now.
Not with everything unraveling before him. "John, please," Claire pleaded. "It's not what you think. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted you to get involved." But John was done with excuses. His mind was made up. The damage was done. There was no coming back from this. Turning back to the group of men, he looked at them with cold, hard eyes. "What do you want?" he demanded. The leader of the group, the man who had stabbed Rex, stepped forward, wiping blood from his sleeve. He didn't seem to care about the dog or the destruction left in their wake. "Your wife's loyalty, she belongs to my father, and you, John, you're in the way." John's pulse quickened. He wasn't going to let them take Claire. He wasn't going to let them control his life any longer. He had made that mistake once, but it wouldn't happen again. The fight wasn't over yet. "I'm not leaving without her," John said, his voice low and dangerous. He pulled Claire closer to him, wrapping an arm around her waist as if to shield her from Moretti's men. She tried to pull away, but John held tight. She wasn't going anywhere, not today. "Then you've made a mistake," the man said,
his grin wide and menacing. Before John could react, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun.
It was too quick. A loud bang rang through the room, the sound of a shot fired. Claire gasped. John's heart stopped, but it wasn't Claire who had been hit. It was the man. He dropped to the ground, a look of shock on his face as he bled, out on the floor. John spun around to see who had shot him. His eyes met Thomas's. "I told you," Thomas said, his voice emotionless, his gun still raised. "You don't get to walk away from this, not without paying the price." Johnny
could barely process it.
He wanted to scream, to ask why Thomas had just killed one of his own men. But the look in Thomas's eyes told him everything he needed to know. There were no rules. There was only survival. John pulled Claire closer, the weight of the moment settling in. Rex was gone, and everything had changed, but for better or worse, the truth was out. And now they were both in the middle of a war they didn't start, but couldn't escape. The weight of the situation hung in the air like a thick fog. John stood there, still gripping Claire, trying to steady his breathing, his mind swirling in chaos. Thomas had just saved their lives, but why? Why would he, after everything that had happened, come to their aid now? The thought twisted John's gut. There was no way this could be as simple as it seemed. As the blood from Moretti's man pooled on the floor, John's gaze flickered between Thomas and Claire. The room was eerily silent, except for the distant sound of Rex's growls still echoing in his ears. The dog had been loyal, had protected him until the very end. But Rex was gone now, and with him went any sense of safety. "Why?" John finally asked, his voice hoarse with a mix of confusion and anger. His eyes never left Thomas. "Why did you do that?" Thomas lowered the gun, but his eyes didn't soften. His gaze remained sharp, calculating. "You're asking the wrong question, John. The right one is, how much are you willing to sacrifice to keep Claire alive?" Claire looked up at Thomas, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, clearly
agitated now. Moretti's men don't take failure lightly. The moment you got involved, John, you became a target too. Your wife, he glanced at Claire, has been living under my father's thumb her whole life. That doesn't end just because you two decided to leave the city and start fresh. The past doesn't just go away. John clenched his fists.
He could feel the anger rising within him, but he couldn't let it consume him. He had to keep his cool. He had to think. Then what now? What's the next move? Thomas's eyes flickered to the doorway, where the remaining mobsters were, still recovering from the chaos Rex had caused. They were waiting for orders for the next step. But it wasn't just about them anymore. John realized that Thomas had to make a choice too. He could either stick with the men who followed his father's every command, or he could change sides. But which side was he really on? "The next move is simple," Thomas said, his voice suddenly steely. "We get out of here. We leave this house and never come back. Because the moment you're found here, they'll come for you again. And next time they won't stop at just one of my men. They'll take you, Claire, and anyone else who's left." John took a deep breath, the weight of Thomas's words sinking in. He couldn't afford to hesitate now, not when Claire's life was on the line. But he also couldn't ignore the betrayal that had been laid bare before him. His wife, the woman he had loved, had been a part of a world far darker than he had ever imagined. And Thomas was more of a wild card than ever. "You think we're just going to run?" John said, shaking his head. "You think this is over? You've dragged us into your world, Thomas, and now we're supposed to run like cowards?" Thomas's jaw clenched, but his eyes were unwavering. "This isn't about running, John. It's about surviving. You think Moretti will let you?"
"Walk away after all this? You think he'll just let you go because you want to live in peace? He'll kill you just to send a message, just to remind everyone that no one crosses him and gets away with it."
John looked down at Claire, his eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and anger. She had been a part of this world, this dangerous, violent world, and now she was in the middle of it. He couldn't leave her behind, but he couldn't trust Thomas
either. "I'm not running," John said, his voice now calm, resolute.
"But I'm not going to let him destroy everything we've worked for. Not without a fight." Claire's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She couldn't, not after everything that had happened. She knew what John was planning. She knew the danger it would bring, but she couldn't stop him. Not anymore. Thomas let out a long sigh. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice a little softer now. "It's not just about the money or the power. It's about loyalty, about survival, and you can't survive if you don't have the right allies." John's eyes locked onto Thomas's, his mind racing with the weight of what he was about to decide. "And you think you're the right ally?" Thomas's lips curved into a brief, almost bitter smile. "In this world, I'm the only ally you've got left." He glanced toward the door again, where the mobsters were beginning to regroup. "But it's up to you now. Do you trust me, or do you want to keep fighting a battle you can't win?" The room grew tense. John had never been one to take the easy path, but everything had changed. This wasn't a world he understood. But Claire was in this world, whether she liked it or not, and she needed him now more than ever. "We're not running," John said, his voice finally steady. He looked down at Claire, his heart heavy with the decision. "But we'll fight on our terms." Thomas nodded. "That's your call, but remember, once you make this choice, there's no turning back." John didn't look back as he grabbed Claire's hand, pulling her toward the door. Rex's blood still stained the floor beneath them, a grim reminder of the price they had already paid. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The moment they stepped out of the house, the sounds of Moretti's men grew louder. They had been waiting, ready for the next move, but John wasn't going to let them dictate it. He wasn't going to let anyone control his life again, not after everything that had happened. But as they drove off, away from the house that had once been their home, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. The shadows were closing in, and no matter how fast they ran, they would never outrun the past. There would be a reckoning. The miles stretched out in front of them as they sped down the darkened highway, the road illuminated only by the harsh glow of headlights. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Claire sat beside him, her face still pale, her hands clutching her seatbelt like a lifeline. Neither of them spoke. Words seemed unnecessary now, for there was nothing left to say. They had left the house behind, abandoned everything in a desperate bid to escape. But the nagging feeling that they weren't running fast enough, that they were only moments away from disaster, gnawed at John. The further they went, the closer the inevitable confrontation with Moretti seemed. They couldn't outrun him. No one could. As if on cue, the ringing of John's phone shattered the silence. He glanced at the screen. It was Thomas. He ignored it. The call came again, and this time he answered. "What now?" John's voice was terse, but his patience was wearing thin. "I told you," Thomas's voice crackled over the line. "You don't get to walk away from this, not without dealing with him." John gritted his teeth. "You're not making this easy, Thomas. I don't need a damn lecture right now. I need a plan." "You've already made the plan," Thomas said, his voice tinged with something that might have been regret or resignation. "Moretti's already on to you. You think he's just going to let you slip away. The old man doesn't forget. You
know that." John's pulse quickened at the mention of the name. Moretti, the real one. Yes, the real one, the father, Antonio Moretti. The name sent a chill down John's spine. Antonio Moretti wasn't just any crime boss.
He was a legend, a man whose reputation had rippled across cities and borders. He had built his empire on blood, fear, and intimidation. The mere mention of his name was enough to make even the most hardened criminals shiver. And now John was tangled in his web. "He's already coming for you," Thomas continued. "He won't stop until he's got what he wants, and what He wants his you, Claire, and every last bit of leverage he can get. He knows you're here. You've been marked, John, so get ready. Why are you telling me this? John asked, his voice tight.
I'm not doing this for you, Thomas said, the bitterness clear in his tone. I'm telling you because you're about to find out just how deep you're in. The old man doesn't play by anyone's rules, not even his own. John slammed
the phone down with a curse, his mind racing. Antonio Moretti wasn't just an obstacle, he was the wall they would have to crash against, and no amount of running could change that. The distance between them and the rest of the world seemed to shrink, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on the car, drawing them closer to a fate they couldn't escape. It wasn't long before the first sign of Moretti's influence made itself known. A black SUV pulled up behind them, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. John's heart sank as the vehicle maintained its steady pursuit, no matter how fast they tried to go. "Claire," he muttered, his voice low, "stay down, don't move." She didn't ask questions. Instead, she slunk down in her seat, her hands trembling. John's mind was running 100 miles an hour, trying to figure out his next move, but there was no clear path. The road ahead was too treacherous, the danger too close. He could hear the rumble of the SUV's engine growing louder, a constant reminder that they were being hunted. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights blinked out, and in that brief moment of darkness, John slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. He grabbed Claire's arm, his grip firm but gentle, urging her to stay low. They both held their breath as they waited for what was to come. The seconds stretched on forever. Then the sound of tires crunching gravel pierced the night. The SUV had pulled off the road, cutting them off. It was no longer just a pursuit, was a trap. John's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the gun under his seat, his fingers cold as they wrapped around the cold steel. He couldn't fight a war with just a gun, but it was all he had. The SUV's door opened, and out stepped a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a sharp suit that practically screamed power. His face was calm, emotionless, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something about the way he moved, that made it clear this man wasn't here for small talk. This man was here to make a statement. The man walked slowly toward the car, his footsteps measured and deliberate. As he neared, he spoke with a heavy accent, his voice deep and commanding. "You made a mistake," he said, his words cutting through the night air like a blade. "I don't forgive mistakes." John's grip on the gun tightened, but he didn't make a move. He couldn't, not yet. "I didn't come here for you, though," the man continued, his eyes locking onto John's. "I came for her." John's eyes flicked toward Claire, who was sitting frozen in her seat. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. The man smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "Your wife, John, she belongs to me?" A chill ran down John's spine. He had heard rumors about Moretti's power, about how he ruled with an iron fist and could snap people like twigs without a second thought. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the cold, calculating man standing in front of him, made it all too real. "Your father," John said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "He's the real boss." The man's eyes flickered with something, amusement perhaps, but his smile remained frozen. "My father doesn't tolerate mistakes, and neither do I." Before John could react, a voice shouted from behind the SUV, the sound of boots hitting the dirt. "Antonio!" The figure who had been watching from the shadows stepped forward. The man was older than the one who had spoken first, his hair slicked back with precision, his eyes sharp with intelligence. This was the real Antonio Moretti. This was the man who had made a name for himself in every dark corner of the world. John could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. There was no escaping this, no running, no bargaining. "You've
made your choice, John," Antonio's voice rumbled, deep and filled with authority. "Now you will pay the price."
And with those words, the world seemed to narrow to a single point, the moment when everything changed. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. The heavy silence hung like a storm cloud, promising destruction. Antonio Moretti stood before John, his presence looming as though the very earth beneath them bowed to his will. His two bodyguards, massive men with cold, calculating eyes, flanked him. Every muscle in John's body was on high alert. He couldn't let this
moment slip by. There was too much at stake. His life, Claire's life, everything they had fought for.
But as he glanced at Claire, still huddled in her seat, fear creeping into her eyes, something shifted. Something in him snapped. He was done with running. Done with playing their game. Antonio's gaze never left him, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I warned you," he said, his voice smooth and chilling. "But you never listen. You've made your bed, John. Now you lie in it." John's grip on the gun tightened. This was it. There was no more talking, no more negotiation. He knew what had to be done. Antonio waved a hand toward his men. "Take care of them," he said simply, as though it was the most casual order in the world. In a flash, both of Antonio's men stepped forward. Their movements were swift, practiced. John didn't have a second to hesitate. He pulled the trigger, the gun shot deafening in the night air. The first bodyguard dropped, a clean shot to the chest. But the second man was faster, his hand reaching for his weapon with terrifying speed. He fired, and the bullet whizzed past John's ear, grazing his skin. Pain shot through his side, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Not now!" Claire screamed, but the sound was drowned by the roar of gunfire. The second bodyguard fell, clutching his chest. He hadn't even made it halfway to John before collapsing, in a heap. Antonio was still standing there, unfazed, a cold smile creeping along his lips. He wasn't afraid of John, not even for a second. "You're good with that gun," Antonio said, his tone casual. "But you won't win this." Before John could react, a sharp pain erupted in his side. He looked down in shock to see a bullet wound bleeding freely, the pain searing through his body like a wildfire. His vision blurred, but his focus remained.
Steady. Antonio had fired. And in that moment, John realized the true nature of the man before him. But there was no time to feel the weight of the wound. John's body surged forward, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He didn't care if
he was shot. He didn't care if he was dying. He was going to make sure Moretti paid. Antonio's eyes flickered to Claire, who was frozen in terror. "She's mine, John," Antonio said, his voice like ice. "You can't save her." A growl echoed from the shadows. Rex, the massive Rottweiler, once loyal to John but now a creature of destruction, launched himself from the bushes. His fury was unstoppable, his teeth bared, his muscles rippling. He charged straight for Moretti's men. They barely had time to react before the dog sank his teeth into one of their throats. The man screamed, but the sound was quickly silenced by the beast's unrelenting power. Rex was a force of nature, a whirlwind of rage and loyalty. But as Rex tore through the mobster, a gunshot rang out from Antonio's side. The bullet hit Rex square in the chest. John's heart stopped. Rex let out a final growl before collapsing, the light leaving his eyes. He didn't make a sound as he hit the ground, the blood soaking the dirt beneath him. John's world tilted. The pain of losing Rex, his loyal companion, was more than he could bear. His vision dimmed, but he forced himself to look up at Antonio, still standing there, unshaken, unaffected by the chaos surrounding him. "You lost, John," Antonio said, his voice cold as steel. "Now your loyalty dies with your dog. You can't save her, and you can't save yourself." John's fingers tightened around the gun, his hands slick with blood. His body screamed for him to stop, but he couldn't. He wasn't going to die like this, not without making sure Moretti knew the cost of crossing him. Antonio raised his
hand, ready to give the final order. But before he could speak, the ground beneath them rumbled. A massive explosion rocked the air.
The world seemed to slow as John was thrown off his feet, the shockwave knocking him to the ground. Dirt and debris filled the air. The screech of metal and the smell of smoke overwhelmed him. His ears rang, and for a moment he couldn't hear
anything. He struggled to get up, blood seeping from the wound in his side.
His vision was fading, but through the haze he saw Claire. She was lying on the ground, unconscious, but still alive. Moretti and his men were nowhere to be seen. John crawled toward Claire, every movement agony. His vision was blurred, his body broken, but he couldn't let this be the end. Not like this. He reached for her, his hands shaking as he pulled her into his arms. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open.
"John,"
she whispered, her voice faint. "Shh," he muttered, his lips pressing against her forehead. "We're not done yet. I'm not letting him win." But as he looked up, the sight before him made his blood run cold. Moretti's men were gone, but there was something far worse waiting. The blast, the explosion. The world they had once known had crumbled into nothingness. And now, John knew, there was no escaping the aftermath. The world around him was dark and silent. Only the faint sound of sirens filled the air. And, in that silence, the realization hit him. Moretti hadn't just left. He had won. But John couldn't let this be the end. Not yet. The explosion had torn through the night, leaving behind a silent world of devastation. The wreckage of the house, the trees, the lives, everything had been reduced to fragments. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and gasoline, a scent that clung to John's skin as he struggled to push through the fog of pain clouding his mind. His side felt as though it was on fire, each breath a battle, but there was something more pressing than his physical agony. Claire. She was still alive, barely. He could feel her body next to his, her pulse faint but steady. He had to get her out of here. He had to make sure she survived, no matter the cost. Moretti. The name echoed in his mind, a reminder of the man who had brought this destruction down upon them. Antonio Moretti, the Italian mob boss who had spent years manipulating, plotting, and pulling strings from the shadows. And now he was here, standing in front of John like an immovable force, a puppet master who thought himself invincible. But there was something in John's eyes now, something that hadn't been there before, the spark of defiance. Antonio Moretti had underestimated him. And for that, he would pay. John could barely keep his hand steady as he reached for his gun. But despite the pain, despite the blood seeping from his wounds, he had one last card to play. Moretti had said it all along. He thought he was untouchable. He thought that with his power, his ruthlessness, he could destroy anything and anyone who stood in his way. But John had learned something over the past months, something he had never realized until now. Power wasn't just about brute force. It wasn't about control. It was about heart. And John still had his. Antonio Moretti was a man who
had no heart, no loyalty. He had destroyed families, manipulated people, and used them like pawns in his grand game.
But now, as he stood there, so sure of his victory, he was about to find out that no matter how much power a man had, it could never replace the one thing that made him truly unstoppable: love. Claire's eyes fluttered open, and though she was pale, her gaze fixed on John. She was weak, but she managed a small smile, a reminder of why John had fought for so long. She reached up, her fingers brushing his bloodied face, and whispered, "We're almost free, John. You can end this. You can end it for both of us." That was all the motivation he needed. With one last surge of strength, John rose to his feet, his eyes locking on to Moretti, who stood across the clearing, still smirking as if victory was already his. "You never understood, did you?" John said through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the pain. "You think power is what makes a man strong. But you're wrong. It's loyalty. It's love. And those things can bring you down." Antonio raised his gun, but John was faster. With a roar of determination, he fired first. The bullet tore through the night, striking Moretti in the chest with brutal force. Antonio staggered back, his eyes widening in shock.
Unable to comprehend what had just happened,
He looked down at the blood blooming from his shirt, disbelief written across his face. You can't," Moretti gasped, struggling to speak, but his words failed him. "You were never untouchable," John replied coldly, his voice steady. "You were just a man, and now you're nothing." Antonio Moretti crumpled to the ground, his gun slipping from his hand. His once imposing presence faded as his life drained away. The reign of terror he had created, the empire he had built, collapsed in an instant. For the first time in years, the world seemed still. The dust settled, the fire dimming in the distance, and all that remained was the echo of John's heartbeat. He had done it. Moretti was dead. John turned to Claire, her fragile hand still gripping his. His heart ached for everything they had been through, for everything they had lost, but as their eyes met, something new began to take root. The chaos was over. They were finally free. In the end, the story was not one of revenge or bloodshed, nor was it the tale of a man who fell because of his greed and hunger for power. It was a story about the strength of loyalty, the sacrifice of love, and the fight for what truly matters. John had lost so much: his dog, his trust, his sense of security. But through it all, he had held on to one thing that mattered more than anything else: his loyalty to Claire. And in the end, that was what saved him. Antonio Moretti, the mob boss who thought himself untouchable, was brought down not by his enemies, not by the violence he had so freely employed, but by the very thing he had never understood: that love, loyalty, and the will to protect those you care about is a power greater than any weapon, greater than any empire. Power might make a man feared, but loyalty makes him respected. Love makes him invincible. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and your fate is the choice to fight for what's right, for what's real, for the people you love. In the end, Moretti learned that lesson too late.